America was built on bold ideas and baffling decisions. For every genius who shaped history, there was an idiot who tried to spell potato on national TV, block progress with fried chicken, or crown himself emperor with a peacock feather. This isn't a documentary. It's a guided tour through 49 of the most gloriously misguided characters to ever make it into the history books, or accidentally rewrite them. Some were fools, some were frauds, a few were both, but all of them left a mark. Welcome to 49 Biggest Idiots in American History. You won't believe who made the list. 1. James Buchanan. There's doing nothing, and then there's James Buchanan, the human embodiment of not my problem. When the country began to split apart at the seams, Buchanan decided to treat it like a roommate dispute over thermostat settings. As states openly seceded, militias formed, and the Constitution strained like a bad hamstring, Buchanan stared into the national abyss and saw nothing to worry about. He was president from 1857 to 1861. You know, just in time to completely ignore the lead-up to the Civil War. South Carolina left the Union in December 1860. By the time he packed up his things, 6 more states had followed. His public stance? That secession was illegal, but also that the federal government had no right to stop it. It's a bit like watching your house catch fire and then arguing that while arson is technically wrong, it would be unconstitutional to call the fire department. Historians often ask if Buchanan was a Southern sympathizer or just pathologically passive. The answer might be both. He packed his cabinet with Southern loyalists, let them raid federal armories, and watched calmly as the Confederacy began to form. All while insisting his hands were tied, even though he was sitting in the most powerful chair in the country. Leadership, to Buchanan, meant elegantly narrating the collapse of a nation like a guy calling play-by-play from a lifeboat. And still, he insisted history would vindicate him. Spoiler, it didn't. Within weeks of his departure, Confederate cannons were aimed at Fort Sumter. His successor, Lincoln, inherited a nation at war with itself, and Buchanan's legacy was sealed, not as a villain, but as an exquisite vacuum. A man so defined by inaction, he accidentally became one of the most consequential figures in American history simply by refusing to do anything at all. He died in 1868, having published a memoir blaming everyone but himself. He titled it Mr. Buchanan's Administration on the Eve of the Rebellion, which, like the man himself, manages to say a lot without ever actually taking responsibility. Which brings us neatly to the man who followed Lincoln. The second worst time for America to have a walking bad idea in the White House. Andrew Johnson. 2. Andrew Johnson. If Buchanan watched the fire and did nothing, Andrew Johnson showed up after the blaze with a bucket of gasoline and a racist monologue. When Abraham Lincoln was assassinated in 1865, the nation was broken. The Civil War had just ended. 4 million formerly enslaved people had been declared free. The South was smoldering, morally, economically, literally. And into this fragile moment stepped Andrew Johnson, a Southern Democrat who somehow managed to be both pro-union and deeply anti-black. He opposed the very idea of Reconstruction, the national effort to rebuild and redefine the country. Johnson vetoed civil rights legislation, opposed the Freedmen's Bureau, and offered mass pardons to former Confederates. His rationale? The best way to heal the nation was to pretend the war hadn't happened. He believed black Americans shouldn't have the right to vote and once declared that this is a country for white men. That wasn't a whisper. That was his platform. Congress, stunned by his open hostility to basic human decency, fought him at every turn. The Republican-controlled House and Senate passed laws specifically to limit his power. Johnson responded by firing officials illegally, which led to his impeachment. He narrowly survived in the Senate by 1 vote, not because anyone liked him, but because they weren't sure what came next. He was the first U.S. president ever impeached, but even more damning. During the most pivotal years for black freedom in American history, he spent his presidency trying to make sure freedom didn't stick. When his term ended, Johnson returned to Tennessee, where he eventually won a Senate seat. He spent his final days grumbling about how everyone had misunderstood him. A bitter man who thought himself a martyr, never realizing he'd made himself a punchline. Still, if you're looking for a president who ruined the sequel to Lincoln's legacy, you could do worse. Or, actually, you couldn't. But let's rewind to a man who didn't even get the chance to ruin things slowly, because he quite literally talked himself to death. 3. William Henry Harrison. Imagine being so committed to making a good first impression that you die trying. William Henry Harrison holds the distinction of having the shortest presidency in American history, 31 days. That's not even enough time to get your forwarding mail sorted. He was 68 when elected in 1840, making him the oldest president at the time. So naturally, on Inauguration Day, he decided to show everyone just how vigorous and unfragile he was by delivering the longest inaugural speech ever recorded, 8,445 words, in the freezing rain, without a coat or a hat. He spoke for nearly 2 hours, which is a long time for any speech, and a really long time if you're trying to impress a crowd of freezing citizens who just want to go home. The speech was full of classical references, policy platitudes, and generic, "I'm an old general and I love the Constitution" blather. No one remembers what he said. Everyone remembers what happened next. He got sick. Then he got sicker. Pneumonia, they said, though later historians suspect it may have been typhoid from bad White House plumbing. Either way, he coughed, declined, and died before he could do anything except prove that performative toughness is a losing strategy in cold weather. The irony? He ran as a man of the people, but he died before the people had any idea what he stood for. His death sparked the first real constitutional crisis over presidential succession. Vice President John Tyler stepped in, setting the precedent that the VP becomes full president, not just acting president, when the commander-in-chief dies. So in a way, Harrison did have one lasting contribution to the presidency. It just wasn't the one he'd intended. He became a historical footnote, a trivia question, and a cautionary tale about ego, weather, and talking too much. Which leads us to another vice president, one who managed to outlast his term, but only barely outwit a potato. 4. Spiro Agnew. Before there was Watergate, before Nixon went full Shakespearean tragedy, there was Spiro Agnew, the man who looked corruption in the eye and said, "Why stop now?" Agnew was Nixon's vice president, handpicked for his appeal to Middle America, meaning he yelled a lot about hippies, blamed the media for everything, and used alliteration like it was a weapon. His favorite insult? Nattering nabobs of negativism. That's what he called journalists. Which is ironic because had journalists not existed, Agnew might have made it to prison instead of resignation. See, while he was wagging his finger at college students in moral decay, Agnew was also taking bribes. And not just before he entered office. During. As in, while sitting in the second highest office in the country, he accepted cash envelopes filled with kickbacks in the White House. Literally. White House. Envelopes. Cash. Like a guy running a side hustle from the Oval Office printer room. When the Justice Department began sniffing around in 1973, Agnew played it exactly how you'd expect, by denying everything and blaming the media. He even tried to spin it into a patriotic crusade, claiming the deep state was out to get him. Classic. Until prosecutors showed up with documents, witnesses, and an entire filing cabinet of receipts. Facing felony charges, Agnew resigned. Not because he was sorry, but because he took a plea deal. He got probation and a fine, surrendered his law license, and walked away. All while the nation's attention shifted to Nixon, who was unraveling in slow motion just a few doors down. But here's the kicker. For years afterward, Agnew still gave speeches about the importance of law and order, still blamed the media, still insisted the real scandal was how he was treated. It's like robbing a bank and then writing a memoir called Why the Vault Was Too Easy to Open. He became the first vice president in American history to resign in disgrace. A man who ran on values, lectured the nation about virtue, and still thought no one would notice the greasy trail of corruption he left behind. And while his legacy is often overshadowed by Nixon's epic fall, Agnew was the dress rehearsal, the warning shot. He showed America what happens when you mistake arrogance for ideology and confuse loudness for leadership. Of course, his successor was quieter, but no less memorable. Because if Agnew gave you envelopes of cash, Dan Quayle gave you something far more dangerous: spelling lessons. 5. Dan Quayle. There are political gaffes, and then there's Dan Quayle, the man who turned potato into a national identity crisis. He was vice president under George H.W. Bush from 1989 to 1993, and while his job was mostly ceremonial, Quayle managed to become a cultural punchline with nothing more than a chalkboard and a child. During a spelling bee-style event at an elementary school, a young student correctly spelled the word potato. Quayle, trying to be helpful, or assert dominance over a 10-year-old, insisted the boy had forgotten something, the letter E. Yes, he added an E, on television, in front of reporters, and teachers, and history. The moment went viral in an era before social media even existed. Comedians feasted. Newspapers ran it for weeks. For many, it became shorthand for everything they feared about American politics. That somewhere out there was a man one heartbeat away from the presidency who thought potatoes came with extra vowels. But Quayle's potato problem was just the frosting. His real issue was that he looked and sounded wildly unprepared for high office. He once compared himself to JFK during a vice presidential debate. His opponent, Lloyd Benson, replied with a line so brutal it might as well have been carved into marble. "Senator, you're no Jack Kennedy." The audience gasped. Quayle blinked, and his political reputation never recovered. He also gave speeches that felt like AI-generated fortune cookies. "We believe that people who are going to be the future are the young people of today," or, "It isn't pollution that's harming the environment, it's the impurities in our air and water." There was something deeply poetic about Quayle's confusion, as if he was trying to say something meaningful and then got lost halfway through a sentence. Still, he wasn't evil, just profoundly out of his depth. His gaffes weren't malicious, just memorably dumb. And in a way, that made him oddly endearing. The kind of political figure who might accidentally declare war on autocorrect. Quayle faded from public life after Bush's defeat in 1992. But his ghost lives on in every clumsy press conference, every awkward VP pick, every meme that whispers, "Remember the E." But if Quayle misspelled vegetables, the next man on our list misfired on an entirely different level, one that involved dueling pistols and a personal vendetta that changed American history. 6. Aaron Burr. You know you've made an impression when your biggest achievement is killing a guy who got a Broadway musical. Aaron Burr was a Revolutionary War veteran, a vice president under Thomas Jefferson, and a man so consumed by ambition he eventually became a walking cautionary tale. In 1804, he famously shot Alexander Hamilton in a duel. Hamilton died. Burr's career? Mortally wounded, though it would twitch for years like a ghost refusing to admit it's dead. The duel was technically illegal, but no one really wanted to press charges. Dueling, while frowned upon, was still the elite way of settling beef in the early 1800s. Burr blamed Hamilton for ruining his political career. Hamilton blamed Burr for being a narcissistic threat to democracy, so they met at dawn, pointed pistols at each other, and Burr proved his point, permanently. After killing one of the founding fathers, Burr finished out his term as vice president. Let that sink in. Imagine if a modern VP gunned down a cabinet member and just kept working. It's hard to exaggerate how bizarre that was, but the early republic was a lawless little experiment with nice wigs. But Burr didn't stop there. After his term, he wandered out west with dreams of grandeur. He allegedly plotted to create a new nation, possibly out of Spanish territory, or maybe Louisiana, or maybe just a floating monarchy inside his own head. No one was quite sure. He met with foreign officials, raised money, and convinced a few folks he had a master plan. Eventually, the government accused him of treason. His trial in 1807 was the O.J. trial of its day, full of drama, conspiracy theories, and wall-to-wall coverage in the press. He was acquitted, mostly because the law required proof of levying war, which Burr, despite his best efforts, had not actually accomplished. Still, he was disgraced, exiled, and politically dead. He spent the rest of his life broke, bitter, and largely forgotten. When he died in 1836, there were no statues, no tributes, no legacy. Just a faint echo of a man who'd been everywhere, tried everything, and failed spectacularly. Aaron Burr remains a historical curiosity, a reminder that being smart, brave, and connected doesn't mean you're not also a walking disaster or a ticking bomb. And speaking of secret disasters, let's take a short trip to South Carolina, where one governor went missing, claimed he was hiking, and accidentally gave the Appalachian Trail a whole new meaning. 7. Mark Sanford. In politics, disappearing acts are usually metaphors. But in 2009, Governor Mark Sanford of South Carolina decided to take it literally. For 6 whole days, no one knew where he was. Not his staff, not his family, not the South Carolina legislature. The governor of an entire U.S. state had vanished like a magician who forgot the second half of the trick. Aides mumbled vague explanations. His wife didn't know. His office didn't know. Reporters were left chasing rumors while the state buzzed with confusion, and maybe a little bit of hope that he had joined a monastery and taken a vow of silence. Then Sanford returned, tanned, calm, refreshed. He held a press conference where he admitted that he had, in fact, not been hiking the Appalachian Trail, as his staff had claimed. No. He had been in Argentina. With a woman, not his wife, whom he described as his soulmate. He cried a little, apologized a little, then pivoted into the kind of emotional overshare usually reserved for people cornered at weddings after too much red wine. The Appalachian Trail story became political folklore, shorthand for bad lies told poorly. As it turned out, Sanford had used state funds for part of his travels. The South Carolina legislature responded with something between disbelief and fury. He was censured but not impeached, mostly because no one wanted the drama of removing him when his term was nearly over. His political career should have ended right there. But American politics loves a comeback story, even a poorly deserved one. A few years later, Sanford ran for Congress and won. He positioned himself as a reformed man, a fiscal conservative, a warning turned wise. Voters apparently appreciated the humility, or had short memories. But his reputation never fully recovered. He went from rising GOP star, someone mentioned as a future presidential contender, to footnote, not because he had an affair, not even because he lied, but because when faced with personal failure, he tried to cover it up with a hiking trip and a map of South America. And that turned him from flawed human to walking punchline. And yet, Sanford is almost quaint compared to our next subject, a man who had multiple chances to stop being his own worst enemy and decided instead to post through it. 8. Anthony Weiner. Anthony Weiner's political career was built on fire, firebrand speeches, fiery media interviews, a reputation for being the loudest guy in the room with the sharpest insults and the most righteous indignation. He was a progressive Democrat from New York who knew how to grab headlines until the headlines grabbed back. It started with a tweet, just a photo, sent to the public instead of as a private message. A selfie that was never meant to see daylight. The internet noticed. So did the media. Weiner claimed he'd been hacked. Then, under mounting pressure, he held a press conference and admitted it wasn't a hack. It was him. And that he'd sent similar photos to several women. While in Congress. Under his real name. From his real accounts. He resigned. The scandal could have ended there. It should have. But Weiner wasn't done. A year later, he re-entered public life with a documentary-worthy comeback campaign for mayor of New York City. It was going well. Polls were rising. Voters were giving him a second chance. Then it happened again. More photos, more messages, this time under the pseudonym Carlos Danger, which, if nothing else, proves the man had a flair for dramatic irony. The new scandal torpedoed his mayoral campaign and earned him another round of late-night monologues and digital shame. But it didn't stop there. A third round of revelations emerged years later, further involving inappropriate communications that eventually triggered an FBI investigation, which, in a moment of national chaos, briefly intersected with the 2016 presidential election. His personal collapse ricocheted into public life like a badly aimed missile. Weiner became the cautionary tale of the Internet age, not just because of what he did, but because he couldn't stop doing it. His downfall wasn't immediate. It was slow, public, and thoroughly documented. Each scandal layered on top of the last until the narrative was no longer about what he did, but why he kept doing it. What kind of man sees the flames rising and throws in another match? At his peak, he was seen as a future senator, maybe even a national figure. But in the end, he became the political embodiment of self-destruction in 140 characters or less. And for the record, Carlos Danger is still burned into the national memory, a pseudonym so perfectly absurd that it outlived the man's career. Still, at least Weiner didn't try to hide behind dignity. Our next character, however, believed in second chances, not for himself, but for his crack pipe. 9. Marion Barry. If political scandals were Olympics, Marion Barry would have walked away with multiple golds and a standing ovation from the judges. Barry was the four-term mayor of Washington, D.C., a civil rights activist turned power broker who blended populist politics with a flair for personal chaos. His administration was often a mess of cronyism, bloated budgets, and chaotic governance. But he remained beloved by parts of the electorate, particularly black Washingtonians, who saw in him a symbol of resistance and access. Then came 1990. A sting operation, a hotel room, a camera, and Barry, caught on tape smoking crack cocaine. As police burst in, he muttered what would become the line forever attached to his name. "The box set me up." The footage was broadcast everywhere. It was shocking, surreal, and somehow darkly comedic. The sitting mayor of the nation's capital, in a drug bust more fitting for a bad TV procedural than real life. Barry was convicted on drug charges and served 6 months in federal prison. His political obituary was written in real time, by the media, by opponents, by his own party. But then something incredible happened. He ran for mayor again in 1994, and won. It was the kind of plot twist that no one saw coming. His slogan, "He may not be perfect, but he's perfect for D.C." Barry rebranded himself as a survivor, a flawed man who had been unfairly targeted by a system he spent his life fighting. And to many voters that rang true. His return to office wasn't marked by triumph so much as gritty persistence. He wasn't rehabilitated, he was just back. The city still faced economic troubles, political dysfunction, and rampant crime. But Barry was unapologetic, street-smart, and deeply rooted in the city's psyche. He ruled with the kind of swagger only a man who had already hit rock bottom could muster. In death he became something else. A myth, a meme, a monument to the idea that failure doesn't mean you're finished. Marion Barry was complicated. A leader. A mess. A symbol. And sometimes a punchline. But if his story reads like Shakespeare in a cracked cloud, our next idiot is more like Dr. Seuss. If Dr. Seuss rewrote the Constitution while confused, stammering, and staring into the middle distance. 10. George W. Bush. If American history were a blooper reel, George W. Bush would have a whole chapter, set to slapstick music and narrated by someone doing a Texas accent. The 43rd President of the United States, Bush entered office through one of the weirdest back doors in modern history, a controversial Supreme Court ruling after the 2000 election that effectively said, "Yeah, let's just stop counting." And yet, despite the strange start, he launched into his presidency with cowboy swagger and that classic down-home charm that made you wonder whether he was going to run the country or open a barbecue joint. He wasn't a villain. That would have been easier to explain. Bush was more like the nation's well-meaning but dangerously uninformed uncle, full of confidence, a little confused by maps, and always just one metaphor away from losing the plot. He once said, "Rarely is the question asked, 'Is our children learning?'" And that was on the campaign trail. Things didn't get much better once he reached office. Bush's defining moment, of course, was the September event, a tragedy that required steady hands, global diplomacy, and nuanced understanding. What followed instead was a 2-decade quagmire in Afghanistan and the catastrophic invasion of Iraq, launched under the assumption that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction. Spoiler, he didn't. The intelligence was flawed, the planning worse, and the post-invasion strategy virtually non-existent. What began as a search for justice turned into a multi-trillion-dollar experiment in nation-building, which ultimately built very little. Under his watch, the federal government also fumbled its response to Hurricane Katrina, leaving New Orleans underwater while Bush praised FEMA's director with the now legendary line, "Brownie, you're doing a heck of a job." The moment became emblematic of an administration that often seemed out of touch, or at least a few PowerPoint slides behind reality. Then there were the gaffes, the malapropisms, the philosophical debates with doors that wouldn't open. Perhaps the most famous? His attempt to warn against being fooled twice, which came out as, "There's an old saying in Tennessee, I know it's in Texas, probably in Tennessee, that says, 'Fool me once, shame on you. Fool me, you can't get fooled again.'" And yet, Bush is not remembered with the same venom as other disgraced figures. Maybe because he seemed to care. Maybe because he painted dogs in retirement. Or maybe because history has a strange way of softening the absurd. Still, for a man who declared mission accomplished before the war even began and handed the economy off to the Great Recession, George W. Bush proved that you don't have to be evil to leave a mess. Just confident, underprepared, and surrounded by people afraid to say no. And speaking of people who charged into disasters with too much confidence, let's turn to the man who thought splitting up his troops during a surprise attack was a good idea. 11. George Armstrong Custer. They say pride comes before the fall. In George Custer's case, it came on horseback, in a flamboyant jacket, followed by a historically loud and bloody silence. Custer was a Union general in the Civil War, known for reckless bravery, and an ego that could barely fit under his cavalry hat. By all accounts, he was charismatic, fearless, and alarmingly convinced of his own indestructibility, a man who saw himself as a heroic figure straight out of a dime novel. And that's probably how he would have preferred to be remembered. Unfortunately, history had other plans. In 1876, Custer led the 7th Cavalry into what is now known as the Battle of the Little Bighorn, or, more famously, Custer's Last Stand. He was tasked with forcing Native American tribes, particularly the Lakota Sioux and Cheyenne, onto reservations. He had 600 men. The enemy had several thousand. So, naturally, Custer split his forces into smaller groups and charged in. The result was less battle and more massacre. Every soldier under his direct command, over 200 men, was killed, Custer included. His body was found stripped and mutilated, a shocking end for a man who had once dined with presidents and fancied himself the future of American military greatness. But here's the catch. Custer wasn't supposed to fight that day. His orders were to wait, assess, coordinate. Instead, he did what Custer always did: assume victory, ignore counsel, and rush into danger with theatrical flair. His confidence was so complete, so blinding, that he failed to recognize the reality on the ground until it was far too late. In death, Custer became a myth. Lionized in the 19th century, criticized in the 20th, and mostly pitied in the 21st. He was brave, yes, but also foolish. He died for a cause history no longer defends, in a war the U.S. shouldn't have been waging, against people whose land he was helping to steal. And yet, his legend lived on. Statues, towns, schools, even a beer. Because America loves a doomed hero, especially one with nice hair and a tragic end. But the truth is less romantic. Custer was a man who ignored warnings, disobeyed orders, and got everyone under his command killed. If there's a lesson to be learned, it's that showmanship is not strategy, and that blind confidence can be just as fatal as enemy bullets. Which brings us to another general who believed in boldness, this time on a global scale involving nuclear weapons and one deeply awkward firing. 12. Douglas MacArthur. If Custer was the tragic golden boy of the 19th century, Douglas MacArthur was the iron-willed drama king of the 20th. MacArthur was a five-star general, a war hero, and a man who thought the spotlight should always be just slightly to his left. His military career spanned decades, from World War I to the Pacific theater of Wowiwotu to the Korean War. Along the way, he became known for his pipe, his sunglasses, and his near-imperial self-image. He didn't just lead, he performed leadership. After Wowiwotu, he oversaw the occupation and reconstruction of Japan, and to his credit, did it remarkably well. He was hailed as a genius, a savior, a military philosopher king. And he believed it. Oh, did he believe it? By 1950, the U.S. was drawn into the Korean War. North Korea invaded the South. MacArthur, placed in charge of United Nations forces, pulled off a bold amphibious landing at Incheon, turning the tide of the war. For a moment he was back on top, chest out, medals gleaming, swagger at full tilt. Then he got cocky. MacArthur pushed forces toward the Chinese border, despite warnings from Washington that doing so could provoke China into entering the war. MacArthur waved those concerns away. China, he insisted, wouldn't dare challenge him. Then China invaded with hundreds of thousands of troops. It was a disaster. The war dragged on. Casualties mounted, and MacArthur, instead of recalibrating, doubled down. He wanted to bomb Chinese supply lines. He wanted to expand the war. He even suggested using nuclear weapons, casually, as though they were just another tool in the general's belt. President Truman, seeing a general off-leash and undermining civilian authority, had enough. In April 1951, he fired MacArthur, a shocking move that made headlines around the world. MacArthur returned to the U.S. to a hero's welcome and gave a dramatic farewell speech to Congress, where he declared that old soldiers never die, they just fade away. And fade he did, slowly, painfully. His ambitions for higher office fizzled. His legacy, once glowing, became more complicated. Was he a brilliant strategist? Yes. Was he also insubordinate, reckless, and obsessed with his own myth? Also, yes. MacArthur's downfall wasn't due to incompetence. It was due to ego. The belief that he and he alone knew what was best. He saw war as theater, and himself as both general and playwright. But Washington, in the end, had the final edit. And if you think that was a betrayal of national trust, just wait until you meet the man who tried to sell an entire military base to the British, and almost got away with it. 13. Benedict Arnold. If the phrase, "don't be a Benedict Arnold," still exists centuries after your death, congratulations. You've earned a special place in the Hall of Idiots. Traitory isn't exactly rare in history, but Benedict Arnold turned it into a brand. His name didn't just become synonymous with betrayal, it became the benchmark. Arnold wasn't always a villain. In fact, he was one of the most competent and daring generals in the American Revolutionary War. He played a critical role in early American victories, most notably at the Battle of Saratoga. He was brave, charismatic, and unusually good at not getting himself killed on the front lines. But Arnold had a problem. Several, actually. He had no money. He had no patience. And he had a burning resentment the size of a cannonball lodged in his pride. Despite his accomplishments, Arnold felt overlooked by Congress, underpaid, and slandered by rivals. He expected parades. He got paperwork and accusations of corruption. So, like any reasonable man with a bruised ego and access to military secrets, he decided the best way to prove his worth was to flip sides. In 1780, he offered to hand over West Point, yes, the West Point, to the British in exchange for cash and a command post. It was treason with a PowerPoint, strategic, detailed, and almost successful. Almost. The plot fell apart when British Major John Andre, carrying documents from Arnold, was captured by American forces. Andre was hanged. Arnold fled. And just like that, the golden boy of American military valor became the textbook case of betrayal. He spent the rest of his life in England, where even the British didn't fully trust him. He was given a minor military post and lived out his days in relative obscurity, unwanted by the country he betrayed and uncelebrated by the one he served. Arnold's name never recovered. To be fair, most traitors don't get second chances, especially the ones who try to sell national security like it's a used sofa. And yet, it's hard not to wonder, what if he'd been given the praise he thought he deserved? Would history have treated him differently? Probably not. Because selling out your own revolution tends to overshadow even the most justified gripes. Which brings us to another man who believed he could start a revolution, but decided, instead of betraying a country, to just build a new one and declare himself king. 14. William Walker. In the 1850s, William Walker looked at Central America and thought, what this region really needs is me. Walker was a lawyer, physician, and freelance adventurer, which is a polite way of saying he was a delusional egomaniac with a passport and no boundaries. He subscribed to an ideology known as filibustering, a 19th century term that had nothing to do with senators talking for hours and everything to do with Americans invading foreign countries for fun and personal glory. Walker's grand vision? To conquer parts of Latin America, install English-speaking governments, and expand slave-holding territories. Yes, he wanted to export American-style manifest destiny and Southern-style plantation economics beyond U.S. borders. A one-man colonial expansionist with delusions of grandeur and a revolver. In 1855, he actually succeeded. Sort of. With a band of about 60 mercenaries, he invaded Nicaragua during a local civil war and quickly maneuvered his way into power. By 1856, he declared himself president. Not interim president, not temporary facilitator, just straight up, I run this country now. To gain favor with the American South, he re-legalized slavery in Nicaragua. To consolidate power, he angered every neighboring Central American nation. Within a year, a coalition of countries formed an alliance to remove him. His regime, which he claimed would bring order and prosperity, brought only chaos and bloodshed. The locals didn't see him as a leader. They saw him as a lunatic with a god complex. Eventually his forces were defeated and Walker fled. But because history loves a man who doesn't know when to quit, he returned, again and again, trying to reclaim his self-declared throne. Each attempt was more pathetic than the last. Finally, in 1860, he was captured by Honduran authorities and executed by firing squad. He died still believing he was destined to rule. His supporters, few as they were, painted him as a martyr. Everyone else saw him for what he was, a man who mistook ego for empire and got a whole lot of people killed chasing a fantasy. Walker didn't just fail as a conqueror, he failed as a human blueprint. His story is a case study in how ambition, unmoored from sanity, becomes a threat not just to others, but to history itself. And if Walker's fantasy involved building an empire, our next subject dreamed of ending one, with nuclear weapons and a catchphrase so aggressive it practically begged for World War III. 15. Curtis LeMay. Curtis LeMay believed in air power, big air power, loud air power. He wasn't just a military general, he was the patron saint of overkill. During World War II, LeMay designed and led the firebombing campaigns over Japan. He flattened cities with strategic precision, always arguing that total war saved lives by ending wars quickly. His philosophy was simple. Don't just beat the enemy. Erase their ability to exist in the first place. He later said, "If I had lost the war, I'd be tried as a war criminal," which is not the kind of quote that goes on motivational posters. But LeMay's most infamous moment came during the Cold War, when he served as head of the Strategic Air Command and then as Chief of Staff of the U.S. Air Force. He believed that nuclear weapons weren't just deterrents, they were tools. Usable, deployable, strategic. During the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962, the closest the world has ever come to nuclear war, LeMay urged President Kennedy to bomb Cuba. He pushed hard for an immediate, overwhelming airstrike followed by invasion. Diplomacy, in his eyes, was for people who hadn't built enough bombers. When Kennedy pursued a blockade and a diplomatic resolution, LeMay fumed. He considered the decision weak, even cowardly. Never mind that the peaceful resolution probably saved humanity. LeMay's view was, strike first, strike hard, and let the survivors sort it out later. His most famous alleged quote? Bomb them back into the Stone Age. Whether he actually said those exact words is debated. But it didn't matter. The quote stuck because it felt true to the man. This was someone who thought nukes were just another tool in the shed. In 1968, LeMay joined George Wallace's presidential campaign as his running mate. Yes, that George Wallace. Segregationist governor and professional menace. LeMay's presence on the ticket was meant to lend credibility, but his nuclear enthusiasm had the opposite effect. When reporters asked if he'd support the use of atomic bombs in Vietnam, LeMay dodged, but not convincingly. The campaign cratered. LeMay retired a deeply controversial figure. Some hailed him as a brilliant strategist. Others saw him as a man who would have launched Armageddon if given the briefest nod. His legacy is radioactive in every sense. He helped build the U.S. Air Force into a formidable power, but he also embodied the terrifying logic of Cold War brinkmanship, that safety could be maintained through the constant threat of total annihilation. And while LeMay dreamed of mushroom clouds and final victories, our next character was just trying to sell you a safer elevator by nearly killing himself in the demonstration. 16. Elisha. Otis. When you think of elevators, you probably don't think of dramatic flair. But Elisha Otis, inventor, tinkerer, and showman, was not content to merely design safety mechanisms. He wanted to prove them, publicly, in front of a crowd, on a platform suspended above certain death. In the 1850s, elevators were a sketchy affair. They were mostly used in factories, powered by ropes and pulleys, and the number one concern was always the same. What if the rope snaps? You wouldn't just descend, you'd plummet. Enter Otis, who invented a safety brake that would engage if the lifting rope failed. A brilliant practical solution to a very practical problem. But genius alone doesn't sell. And Otis was having trouble getting anyone to care. So in 1854, during the Crystal Palace exhibition in New York, he built a platform high above the crowd, stood atop it, and had an assistant cut the hoisting rope with an axe. People gasped, screamed, braced for a collapse. But the brake kicked in. The platform stopped. Otis calmly declared, "All safe, gentlemen, all safe." It worked. Sales soared. Modern elevators owe their very existence to that moment, and to the mad confidence of a man who knew his invention was solid enough to bet his own life on it. But here's where the story takes a turn. Despite the drama of his demonstration, Otis didn't actually make much money. He died just a few years later in 1861, before elevators became widespread in skyscrapers and urban buildings. His sons carried on the business and turned it into a corporate juggernaut. Today, the Otis Elevator Company is one of the most recognizable names in vertical transportation. Elisha, however, remains largely unknown outside tech history trivia. He wasn't an idiot in the malicious sense. He didn't swindle or scheme or collapse governments. But there's something undeniably absurd about inventing a device that changed the modern world and still managing to die in relative obscurity. His life was a reminder that being first isn't always enough. Sometimes the man with the vision isn't the man who profits from it. Still, it's hard to knock the guy who invented modern elevator safety by almost falling to his death. Now, while Otis risked his life to keep others from falling, our next figure fell face first into the American dream, and managed to lose everything, despite having literal gold at his feet. 17. John Sutter. John Sutter had a dream. to build an agricultural empire in the still wild land of California. And for a brief moment in the 1840s, it looked like he might actually pull it off. He was a Swiss immigrant who arrived in the United States with charm, ambition, and just enough questionable backstory to sound like a character from a historical novel. Sutter settled in what would become Sacramento and established Sutter's Fort, a kind of mini-kingdom with farms, livestock, and laborers. He envisioned a peaceful, self-sustaining colony. The land was fertile, the prospects good. And then, gold happened. In 1848, one of Sutter's employees, James Marshall, discovered shiny flakes in the river near the mill. He brought them to Sutter, who immediately recognized what it was, and knew exactly what it meant: disaster. Because Sutter wasn't in the gold business. He was in the land business, the farming business. And the moment the word got out, he knew his dreams were finished. Thousands of prospectors poured into California, overran his land, stole his livestock, tore down his fences, and squatted on his property. His workers deserted him. His crops failed. His empire, built slowly over years, was devoured in months. Sutter tried everything to reclaim his holdings. He petitioned the U.S. government for compensation, claiming he had been promised protection under earlier agreements with Mexico and later California. He even traveled to Washington, D.C. in his old age, pleading for justice. He was ignored. The man who had owned the land where the greatest gold rush in American history began died penniless and bitter. He didn't get rich. He didn't even get credit. History barely mentions him. Instead, he became the sad footnote to someone else's fortune. His failure wasn't due to laziness or folly. It was timing, bad luck. A brutal reminder that sometimes you can be right at the center of history and still get trampled by it. So, while John Sutter watched his fortune vanish under a tidal wave of strangers with shovels, our next entry tried to revolutionize medicine and ended up creating one of the most humiliating public spectacles in the history of surgery. 18. Horace Wells. If Horace Wells had a legacy motto, it might be, "Pain is optional. Humiliation, however, is forever." Wells was a dentist in the mid-1800s who believed that surgery didn't have to be agony. This was a revolutionary thought in an era when anesthesia was mostly whiskey and biting down on a stick. After witnessing a demonstration where a man under the influence of nitrous oxide, laughing gas, didn't feel pain, Wells realized he might have found the future of medicine. He began testing nitrous oxide on his dental patients, extracting teeth while they giggled or slipped into blissful unconsciousness. It worked, at least sometimes. Encouraged by his initial success, Wells was invited to perform a public demonstration at Massachusetts General Hospital, the Harvard-affiliated proving ground of 19th-century medical ego. And here's where it all went sideways. Wells administered the gas. The patient sat down. The tooth was pulled, and the patient screamed, loudly, in front of a room full of skeptical doctors. The audience erupted in laughter, not the kind Wells had intended. The demonstration was declared a failure. He was heckled. His career as an innovator was effectively over. But what happened? Why did the gas fail? Historians think the dosage was wrong. Too little gas, too much pressure, or perhaps the patient just panicked. Whatever the reason, it turned Wells into a cautionary tale. His rivals, including a former student, went on to refine anesthesia using ether, a different compound that soon took over the surgical world. Wells was left behind, his discovery discredited, his reputation in tatters. He faded into obscurity, while others took credit for ideas he helped pioneer. It was a tragic, ironic end for a man who truly believed in reducing human suffering, but ended up being remembered for causing it, at least in one very public, very unfortunate instance. So while Horace Wells dreamed of a pain-free future, he instead got a legacy built on one poorly timed scream. And in a twist that feels almost Shakespearean, the man who tried to remove pain from surgery ended up creating one of the most painful moments in medical history for himself. Our next character also worked in medicine, sort of. But instead of laughing gas, he specialized in snake oil. and occasionally changed his name just to stay ahead of the law. 19. William A. Rockefeller, Sr. Before there was John D. Rockefeller, oil tycoon and robber baron extraordinaire, there was his father, William Avery Rockefeller, Sr., the man who might have inspired the phrase professional scoundrel. A self-described botanic physician, Rockefeller Sr. sold elixirs, tonics, and cures that cured absolutely nothing. He called himself Dr. William Livingston, wore top hats like a second skin, and traveled from town to town dispensing miracle oils made from, among other things, alcohol, opium, and bold-faced lies. He wasn't a doctor, not by training, not by certification, and certainly not by ethics. But in 19th century America, that hardly mattered. Medicine was an unregulated Wild West, and Rockefeller Sr. rode in like a con artist with a business card. He peddled his homemade cancer cure, which involved mystery ingredients, vague promises, and the kind of charm that makes you lose your wallet while thanking the thief. This wasn't just small-time fraud. He made a career out of deception. He faked his own death more than once. He abandoned families, juggled aliases, and skirted law enforcement with the slippery grace of a man who saw accountability as a kind of suggestion. His various medical ventures were really just fronts for his grifts. And when he wasn't selling fake cures, he was telling tall tales about being a former soldier, a secret agent, or a man with powerful friends in Washington. Spoiler, he wasn't any of those things. His most notable legacy, of course, is John D. Rockefeller, who took a very different approach to success. Where the son built an empire of oil and monopolies, the father built a labyrinth of falsehoods and itinerant chaos. And yet, it's hard not to see the philosophical connection. The senior Rockefeller understood something fundamental about America, the power of the story, even if it's not true, especially if it's not true. William Sr. disappeared from public life in his later years, eventually dying under a false name, having convinced the government, and perhaps himself, that he was someone else entirely. No grand fortune, no repentance, just the quiet end of a man who spent his whole life running one step ahead of the truth. He left behind a trail of swindles and a son determined to do the opposite, or perhaps to do the same things, just better, and with lawyers. But while John D. made billions, William Sr. made folklore. He was the prototype for the American snake oil salesman, proof that you could be historically significant while being morally bankrupt and vaguely sticky. And if Rockefeller sold fake cures, our next subject sold fake investments, Ponzi style, straight into the savings of Civil War generals. 20. Ferdinand Ward. Before Bernie Madoff became the face of modern Ponzi schemes, there was Ferdinand Ward, a 19th century financial fraudster so bold, so shameless, that he managed to bankrupt one of the most famous generals in American history. Ward didn't look like a con man. He looked like trust. Neatly dressed, well-spoken, with an air of financial expertise that screamed respectable. In the early 1880s, he co-founded a firm with Ulysses S. Grant's son, Ulysses Jr. That connection gave Ward immediate credibility, because if you can't trust the son of a former president and Civil War hero, who can you trust? Ward called the firm Grant & Ward and presented it as an elite investment house with access to high-yield opportunities that weren't available to ordinary investors. The reality? It was a full-scale Ponzi scheme. He took money from new investors and used it to pay out returns to older ones, all while faking ledgers, forging documents, and pretending the business was booming. The illusion worked. For a while. People poured money into the firm. Even Ulysses S. Grant himself invested his personal savings, which turned out to be a mistake of historical proportions. When the scheme collapsed in 1884, it wasn't just a financial scandal. It was a betrayal that left the former president virtually penniless in his final years. Grant had to finish his memoirs while dying of cancer, just to make sure his family would have something left. Ward was arrested, tried, and sentenced to 10 years in prison. He served 6 and came out with the same smug confidence he'd always carried. He blamed others, claimed innocence, even insisted he'd just been unlucky. like most guys who accidentally defraud the nation's most famous general. But what makes Ward special in the pantheon of American idiocy isn't just the scale of his fraud. It's the audacity of the target. You defrauded Ulysses S. Grant? The man who took Richmond? Who survived Shiloh and Vicksburg? Who beat Robert E. Lee? You looked at that guy and thought, easy mark. And you were right. There's a tragic poetry in it. Grant, who spent his life defeating enemies on the battlefield, was ultimately undone by a smiling man in a business suit with a pen and a ledger. Ward's con was one of America's earliest high-profile financial collapses, and it destroyed reputations, families, and legacies. His punishment, in hindsight, was almost gentle. 6 years for financial arson. And then back into the world, no remorse, just a shrug and a new scam brewing. But if Ward's lies were hidden behind spreadsheets, our next entry ran a full-blown health tech empire based on fiction, hype, and a box that didn't even work. 21. Elizabeth Holmes. There's Silicon Valley ambition, and then there's Elizabeth Holmes, the woman who took the phrase, "fake it till you make it," and stretched it until it snapped in court. Holmes was the founder and CEO of Theranos, a startup that promised to revolutionize blood testing. With just a single drop of blood, her machines, called Edison devices, could supposedly run hundreds of tests, faster, cheaper, and more accurately than traditional labs. The pitch was irresistible. Investors lined up. Walgreens signed on. The boardroom filled with former cabinet members and retired generals. She was on magazine covers. She wore a black turtleneck. People whispered, "Female Steve Jobs." But there was one small problem. The machines didn't work. From the beginning, Theranos was built on a premise that hadn't been proven, then defended like a trade secret. Internal scientists raised alarms. Lab results were manipulated. Tests were sometimes run on competitors' equipment just to make the results look good. But Holmes maintained the illusion with messianic intensity. Tight control over employees, aggressive non-disclosure agreements, and a bunker-like secrecy that would have made a Bond villain say, "Okay, maybe tone it down." When journalists started digging, especially Wall Street Journal reporter John Carey Rue, the story unraveled. Whistleblowers emerged. The Edison machine was revealed to be a $10 billion mirage. By 2018, the company was dissolved. Holmes and her partner Sunny Balwani were charged with fraud. The trial became a media circus, full of awkward defense strategies and public reckonings. Holmes's defense leaned hard on charisma. She claimed ignorance. She cried. She blamed Balwani. But jurors, and the public, saw through it. In 2022, she was convicted on multiple counts of wire fraud and conspiracy. The sentence? More than 11 years in prison. The message? If you're going to lie, don't do it with blood. Theranos wasn't just a bad startup. It was a dangerous one. Patients received false test results that led to panic, confusion, and potential harm. Investors lost millions. Trust in medical innovation took a hit. And Holmes, who once stood as a symbol of disruptive genius, became a cautionary tale for the ages. Yet even in disgrace, Holmes retained her eerie calm, the voice, the gaze, the turtleneck, as if still auditioning for the role of visionary CEO in a film about someone who actually invented something. If William A. Rockefeller Sr. sold snake oil out of a wagon, Holmes did it with venture capital, glass walls, and keynote speeches. A 19th century grift, rebooted for the TED Talk generation. And speaking of fraudulent medicine, let's meet the next man on our list, a doctor who believed you could cure impotence with goat parts. 22. Dr. John Brinkley. If medical malpractice had a mascot, Dr. John Brinkley would be wearing the sash. This is the man who looked at a goat, looked at a man, and thought, yes, this is the future of urology. In the early 20th century, Brinkley became famous, or infamous, for claiming he could cure male impotence by surgically implanting goat testicles into human bodies. Yes, you read that right, goat testicles. Transplanted into men. To cure everything from fatigue to infertility to vague existential malaise. And people bought it. Literally. Brinkley wasn't just a backroom quack. He was a showman. He set up clinics, advertised in newspapers, and later pioneered medical infomercials via radio. His confidence was unmatched. He spoke with the conviction of someone who had discovered a miracle cure, even though what he'd really discovered was a genius-level grift wrapped in a lab coat. His operations were often conducted with little to no hygiene, documentation, or follow-up. Unsurprisingly, many patients suffered complications. Some died, but Brinkley kept going because the money kept flowing. He opened hospitals, bought mansions, and even ran for governor of Kansas, twice. He almost won, too. If the ballots hadn't been tampered with in his second run, he might have become the world's first goat-based political dynasty. Brinkley's empire eventually began to collapse under the weight of medical scrutiny. In the 1930s, the American Medical Association investigated him, and he lost his medical license. The Federal Radio Commission shut down his broadcasting operations. Lawsuits from patients and families started piling up like unread prescriptions. Yet Brinkley kept broadcasting from Mexico, launching what became known as border blaster radio stations, some of the most powerful in North America, to keep pushing his brand. He died broke in 1942 after being hounded by lawsuits and tax collectors. His legacy? A bizarre cautionary tale about what happens when surgical ambition, marketing genius, and zero ethics combine into one disturbingly successful enterprise. Brinkley didn't just perform bad medicine. He turned it into performance art. And while modern science left him behind, his story still serves as a reminder. Charisma and confidence are no substitute for competence, especially when scalpels are involved. But if Brinkley believed in pseudo-energy flowing through goat parts, our next guy believed that orgasms could cure cancer. And that's somehow the less insane part of his resume. 23. Wilhelm Reich. If there were a Nobel Prize for most creatively bizarre misuse of science, Wilhelm Reich would have won it by acclamation, multiple times. Reich was a student of Freud, a psychoanalyst by trade, and a man with a gift for taking real ideas and dragging them, kicking and screaming, into the twilight zone. His big idea? Orgone energy. Reich believed he had discovered a universal life force, a kind of biocosmic power, that was responsible for everything from mental health to weather patterns. He also believed that healthy orgasms were essential for the flow of this energy, and that blocked orgone could cause cancer. His solution? A metal-lined box called the orgone accumulator. Patients, or perhaps clients is the better word, would sit inside these boxes to absorb healing orgone from the atmosphere. Some sat for hours. Some claimed they felt energized, awakened, even healed. Others, understandably, just got sweaty and confused. Reich's theories were never accepted by mainstream science. In fact, his peers, even the more fringe ones, backed away slowly. But Reich pushed harder. He wrote books, gave lectures, and insisted that governments and scientific authorities were suppressing the truth. He also began building more devices, including a cloudbuster, which he said could control the weather using orgone energy. In one particularly bold claim, he said he used it to end a drought in Maine. By the 1950s, the FDA had had enough. They declared his devices fraudulent and banned them. Reich, refusing to comply, kept selling them. Eventually, he was arrested for violating court injunctions, and his orgone boxes were seized and destroyed. Yes, the federal government literally burned his equipment and his books. Reich was sentenced to prison and died in custody in 1957. At the time, he was largely dismissed as a crank, but in the decades since, he's become a kind of cult figure, a symbol of outsider genius to some, and a cautionary tale of pseudoscientific hubris to others. There's something tragically poetic about Reich. He wasn't a con man like Brinkley. He believed in his theories. But belief, when untethered from evidence, tends to drift, until one day you're sitting inside a metal box, waiting for invisible particles to rearrange your destiny. And speaking of science gone wrong, our next figure didn't just misuse data. He helped lay the intellectual groundwork for one of the most enduring and dangerous ideas in American history. 24. Samuel George Morton. Before there was scientific racism, There was Samuel George Morton, the 19th century physician who tried to measure human worth one skull at a time. Morton was obsessed with craniometry, the study of skull size and shape, and he amassed one of the largest skull collections in the world. Over 1,000 crania from all corners of the globe, labeled, catalogued, and studied with the clinical detachment of a man who thought human variation could be boiled down to calipers and bone density. His goal? To prove that the races of mankind were inherently unequal. He measured cranial capacity and concluded, unsurprisingly to him, that white Europeans had the largest brains and therefore were the most intelligent. Africans and Native Americans, by his calculations, had smaller skulls and were intellectually inferior. His work was published and cited widely, especially by pro-slavery advocates in the United States, who saw his research as divine confirmation of racial hierarchy. There were problems, obvious ones, like the fact that his data was cherry-picked, his methods inconsistent, and his measurements highly biased. Later reviews, including a famous reassessment by Stephen Jay Gould, argued that Morton's work was riddled with unconscious bias. He didn't so much find what the data told him as he told the data what to say, and yet Morton was considered a pioneer in his time. His work laid the foundation for scientific racism, eugenics, and a long line of ideologies that cloaked prejudice in the language of objectivity. He wasn't just wrong. He was dangerous, because he dressed bigotry in a lab coat and called it truth. Today, his skulls are still housed in museums, and his legacy is discussed not as a source of pride, but as a warning. He reminds us how easily science can be twisted to fit the cultural narratives of the powerful, and how data, when filtered through bias, becomes propaganda. Morton wasn't evil in the traditional sense. He was a product of his time. But time has a way of sharpening its judgment. And looking back, it's clear that his greatest legacy isn't in the shelves of skulls he left behind, but in the long shadow of ideas that should have stayed buried with them. Next up is another academic figure who took a problematic theory and tried to dress it up in charts, graphs, and intellectual polish, only to find himself at the center of one of the most controversial books in modern American history. 25. Richard Herrnstein. Richard Herrnstein wasn't a snake oil salesman, a cult leader, or a goat surgeon. He was a Harvard psychologist, which in some ways made the damage even harder to spot. His legacy comes not from what he healed or built, but from what he claimed to measure: intelligence, and its alleged connection to race. In 1994, 3 years after Herrnstein's death, his co-authored book, The Bell Curve, exploded into public discourse like a polite academic grenade. Written with political scientist Charles Murray, the book made a series of provocative claims: that intelligence, measured through IQ tests, is the best predictor of life outcomes, that it's largely inherited, and that racial differences in average IQ scores are likely rooted in genetics. The implication? That social inequalities might not be fixable, because they're biologically determined. Cue the firestorm. Critics from across the political and academic spectrum dismantled the book point by point. They argued it misused statistics, relied on dubious sources, and ignored the overwhelming influence of socioeconomic factors. Even defenders of free inquiry squirmed at the implications. Was this science, or was it eugenics with footnotes? Herrnstein himself had laid the groundwork years earlier with essays linking IQ to social structure, suggesting that a cognitive elite was emerging in America, separating itself from the lower classes by sheer genetic merit. But the bell curve brought these ideas into the mainstream, with charts, graphs, and an unsettling sense of detachment, as if centuries of racial trauma could be sorted out on a spreadsheet. The real damage wasn't the book's conclusions, which were widely debunked, but the tone in which it asked the questions. It cloaked a deeply controversial thesis in the language of academic neutrality. It gave ammunition to racists while insisting it was only following the data. Herrnstein wasn't a raving ideologue. He didn't shout from soapboxes or wear tinfoil hats. He believed in the cold objectivity of numbers, But objectivity without reflection is just blindness with a calculator. And in trying to quantify intelligence, he helped revive some of the oldest, ugliest ideas in American history, all under the banner of scientific curiosity. If Morton's legacy was measuring skulls to justify supremacy, Herrnstein's was running regression analyses to do the same. Different century, same mistake. And if this all seems like a bleak detour into academic arrogance, don't worry. Our next figure leaves behind the cold halls of science and heads to the dusty, booze-filled back rooms of the Old West, where law was whatever one man said it was, especially if he was holding court in a saloon. 26. Judge Roy Bean. Long before there were judicial robes, court reporters, or any real sense of legal procedure, there was Judge Roy Bean, self-declared law west of the Pecos and proud dispenser of justice from a saloon. Bean wasn't a judge in the conventional sense. He was appointed Justice of the Peace in the desolate Texas border town of Langtree in the late 1800s, at a time when the American legal system was more suggestion than structure. But Bean took his role seriously, or at least seriously enough to hang a sign over his bar that read, "Law West of the Pecos." His courtroom was a whiskey-soaked room attached to the saloon he owned. He held trials while serving drinks, fined people in beer, and frequently quoted laws that didn't exist. His decisions were often made on the fly, based on personal feelings, the mood of the room, or whether he liked your face. He fined dead men for carrying concealed weapons, then pocketed the cash from selling their guns. He once held a trial for a man who had been lynched before the court date, found him guilty posthumously, and still collected a fine. In Bean's court, guilt wasn't determined by law. It was determined by convenience. Despite this, or maybe because of it, he became a legend. Newspapers picked up tales of his rough justice, often embellishing or outright fabricating them. Bean leaned into the myth, even naming his courtroom the Jersey Lily, after a British actress he admired but never met. He sent her letters, gifts, and even built a makeshift opera house in her honor, which she never visited. Bean's reputation as a folk hero obscures the fact that his legal practice was closer to improvisational theater than jurisprudence, but he symbolized something uniquely American. The idea that in lawless times, what mattered wasn't the rule of law, but the illusion of it. He died in 1903, still convinced he had done justice his own way, and in some sense, he had. If you define justice as whatever one man decides after a few drinks and a coin toss. Bean wasn't corrupt in the traditional sense. He wasn't greedy exactly. He just didn't care about systems. To him, the law wasn't a code. It was a performance. And he played his part with a flourish, a revolver, and an ever-full glass. But if Bean made justice up as he went, our next subject built an entire movement on imaginary enemies, and in the process plunged the country into one of its darkest paranoia. 27. Joseph McCarthy. You didn't have to be a communist to be afraid of Joseph McCarthy. In fact, the whole point was that it didn't matter what you were, only what someone could accuse you of being. In the early 1950s, Senator McCarthy turned anti-communist fear into a national sport. He claimed, without evidence, that the U.S. government was riddled with communists, spies, saboteurs, traitors, all hiding in plain sight. He waved lists at press conferences, gave numbers, named names. None of it held up. But in Cold War America, fear was stronger than fact. At first, the country listened. He was bold. He was brash. He spoke with the moral certainty of someone who had never fact-checked himself. His accusations ruined careers, shattered reputations, and sent people scrambling to prove what they weren't. Communists, sympathizers, or merely too quiet during staff meetings. Government employees, writers, teachers, and Hollywood actors were hauled before committees, asked to explain their associations, their opinions, their bookshelves. People named friends to save themselves. Some simply vanished from public life. The term McCarthyism was born, shorthand for baseless accusations made with maximum volume. The irony: McCarthy had no plan, no master list, no investigative brilliance. He had bluster, and in a moment of national insecurity, bluster was enough. He chaired the Senate Permanent Subcommittee on Investigations, which conducted televised hearings that mixed politics with spectacle. But in 1954, he made a critical error. He went after the U.S. Army. The hearings that followed, the famous Army McCarthy hearings, revealed him as petty, cruel, and reckless. And then came the moment that ended him, when Army Attorney Joseph Welch looked at McCarthy, after one of his more desperate personal attacks, and said, "Have you no sense of decency, sir? At long last?" America collectively exhaled. The spell was broken. McCarthy was censured by the Senate that same year. His influence collapsed. He died a few years later, politically exiled, drinking heavily, still convinced he was right. But his impact lingered. The fear he conjured didn't vanish with him. The accusations, the blacklists, the paranoia, they became part of the American playbook. And decades later, the term witch hunt would be dusted off and used again, often by people who never knew the name McCarthy, but were imitating his tactics all the same, because the real legacy of Joseph McCarthy isn't just the damage he did. It's how easy he made it look, how quickly fear can overpower reason, and how little it takes to turn accusation into truth. Next is a man who didn't just lie, he earned his own nickname for it. A man so slippery, the only thing that stuck was the phrase Continental Liar. 28. James G. Blaine. You don't earn the nickname the Continental Liar from the state of Maine without putting in some serious, tireless work, lying coast to coast with style, ambition, and just the right splash of 19th century charisma. James G. Blaine was a U.S. Senator, a Speaker of the House, a two-time Secretary of State, and a man who ran for president and somehow managed to lose to one of the most forgettable presidents in history, Grover Cleveland. All because of one thing: he couldn't stop being shady. Blaine was the prototype for the slick, polished politician who always sounded like he knew what he was talking about, even when he didn't. He had a gift for language, loved the spotlight, and absolutely thrived in Washington's post-Civil War political landscape. A time when corruption wasn't a scandal, it was just networking. His biggest scandal, the one that got him branded a liar from sea to shining sea, involved shady railroad dealings. Specifically, the Little Rock and Fort Smith Railroad. While serving in Congress, Blaine allegedly used his political influence to benefit the company in exchange for stock and payments. He denied everything, of course, repeatedly, passionately, under oath. Unfortunately for Blaine, someone had saved the receipts, or more accurately, the letters. Known as the Mulligan Letters, they were a series of correspondences between Blaine and the railroad's executives that appeared to contradict his public denials. One particularly famous quote, written by Blaine himself, read, "Burn this letter," which is exactly what you don't write if you want to look innocent. When the letters were discovered, Blaine tried to recover them, and then, in true 19th century scandal fashion, physically snatched them back and refused to return them. This was less dignified statesman and more guy caught sneaking documents into his coat. The scandal dogged him for years. When he finally secured the Republican nomination for president in 1884, Democrats had a field day. They chanted, "Burn this letter," at rallies. Political cartoons depicted him with railroad tracks running through his pockets. And just when Blaine needed to seem above it all, he attended a dinner with wealthy elites in New York, further cementing the image of him as an out-of-touch tool of the corporate class. He lost to Grover Cleveland, who was not exactly a charisma factory. But he had one thing Blaine didn't: plausible deniability. Blaine's loss was razor-thin but definitive. He never became president, but his influence lingered. In foreign policy, he pushed for Pan-American cooperation, and there's even a bust of him in the U.S. Capitol. But the phrase "Continental Liar" stuck harder than any policy achievement. It followed him into the grave, a title no resume can shake. And if Blaine twisted truth for profit, the next man on our list twisted faith into something far more dangerous. Because while lies can sink a candidacy, delusions can destroy entire communities. 30. Charles Manson. There are cult leaders, and then there's Charles Manson, the bug-eyed philosopher of doom who never technically killed anyone himself but orchestrated a murder spree that haunted American culture for decades. Manson's early life was a chaotic blend of petty crime, reform schools, and general aimlessness. He spent much of his youth and early adulthood behind bars, where he developed a manipulative charm, an obsession with race war paranoia, and a grab-bag theology made of stolen New Age philosophies, Beatles lyrics, and whatever was lying around the prison library. By the late 1960s, Manson had assembled a ragtag group of mostly young women, the Manson family, and moved into the desert outskirts of Los Angeles. There, on a decaying ranch, he preached a doctrine of apocalypse, claiming an imminent race war, which he called Helter Skelter after the Beatles song, would end society as we know it, and that he and his followers would rise from the ashes as divine rulers. When the war didn't start on its own, Manson decided to help it along. In August 1969, members of the Manson family committed a series of gruesome murders in Los Angeles, including the home invasion and killing of actress Sharon Tate and several others. The brutality shocked the nation. The randomness of the victims and the cryptic messages left at the scenes turned the case into a cultural obsession. The hippie movement, already teetering, took a massive public relations hit. Peace, love, and LSD suddenly had a new face. Charles Manson's. The trial was a media circus. Manson carved an X into his forehead, claimed he was Jesus, threatened the judge, and orchestrated bizarre courtroom antics. His followers sat outside the courthouse, singing songs and carving matching symbols into their own foreheads. It was the kind of spectacle that made people wonder if the world was actually coming apart. Manson was convicted of conspiracy to commit murder and sentenced to death, which was later commuted to life imprisonment when California temporarily abolished the death penalty. He remained in prison until his death in 2017, occasionally giving interviews that ranged from cryptic to terrifying to weirdly boring. Manson wasn't a mastermind. He was a manipulative drifter who stumbled into cultural power by accident, fueled by desperation, delusion, and an uncanny ability to find people more lost than he was. He turned music into prophecy, violence into ritual, and loneliness into a weapon. But while his cult ended in prison and infamy, the next man took his spiritual fantasies in a different direction, not with prophecies of race war, but with intergalactic ghost stories and tax-deductible salvation. 31. L. Ron Hubbard. If Charles Manson was the dark, chaotic nightmare version of 1960s counterculture, L. Ron Hubbard was its polished science fiction cousin, a man who took pulp novels, fringe psychology, and a dash of galactic space opera, and somehow built a tax-exempt empire called Scientology. Before he was a prophet, Hubbard was a writer, a prolific one, churning out hundreds of stories across genres, westerns, romances, fantasy, and especially science fiction. He knew how to entertain. He knew how to sell. And most importantly, he knew how to keep the plot moving, even when the details made no sense, which turned out to be excellent training for starting a religion. In 1950, Hubbard published Dianetics, The Modern Science of Mental Health, a book that claimed to unlock the human mind and eliminate psychological trauma. According to Hubbard, all negative emotions and irrational behaviors came from engrams, buried memories from painful experiences. Through a process called auditing, you could supposedly erase these engrams and achieve a state called clear. This wasn't therapy. This was self-purification. And it caught on. Dianetics briefly became a bestseller, but psychologists hated it. Medical boards dismissed it. Publishers backed away. So Hubbard pivoted. He called Dianetics a spiritual technology and created the Church of Scientology in 1954. That's where things got truly weird. Hubbard layered on new teachings, expanding Scientology into a multi-tiered belief system involving past lives, extraterrestrial civilizations, and an evil galactic overlord named Xenu. According to church doctrine, available only to high-ranking members, after significant donations, Billions of alien souls were dumped into volcanoes on Earth 75 million years ago and now inhabit human bodies as thetans. If that sounds like the plot of a B-movie, well, it might have been. Critics called it a cult. Former members spoke of harassment, manipulation, and financial exploitation. But Hubbard built a fortress of secrecy, legal pressure, and media control. Scientology went after journalists, defectors, and government agencies with lawsuits and smear campaigns. When the IRS revoked its tax-exempt status, the church waged an internal war of attrition until it was reinstated in 1993. Hubbard spent the last years of his life in seclusion, on the run from subpoenas and legal scrutiny. He died in 1986, leaving behind a global organization with celebrity followers, elaborate auditing rituals, and billions in assets. Was Hubbard a true believer? Hard to say. One of his most quoted and disputed sayings is, "You don't get rich writing science fiction. If you want to get rich, you start a religion." Whether he said it or not, the result speaks for itself. Scientology remains controversial, powerful, and deeply secretive. Its founder, a man who turned cosmic fiction into cosmic doctrine, and proved that in America, there's no idea too outlandish if you say it with enough certainty. But while Hubbard built a space-themed religion, our next cult leader believed the actual spaceship was already here, hiding behind a comet, waiting to beam up his chosen few in matching tracksuits and identical haircuts. 32. Marshall Applewhite. Marshall Applewhite, better known to the world as the wild-eyed leader of the Heaven's Gate cult, didn't just believe in aliens. He believed they were coming to rescue him, and only him, plus a select group of devoted followers who had cut ties with their families, shaved their heads, and agreed to live as celibate ascetics in rented California houses. Applewhite was a former music professor with a soft Texas drawl and the aura of someone permanently teetering between mysticism and a nervous breakdown. In the 1970s, he met Bonnie Nettles, a nurse with a passion for New Age spirituality and apocalyptic prophecy. Together, they launched a spiritual movement blending Christianity, UFO mythology, and the growing American appetite for weird, offbeat salvation. They taught that human bodies were mere vehicles and that their true selves were extraterrestrial beings trapped in flesh. Earth, they claimed, was about to be recycled, and the only way to escape was to shed the body and ascend to the next level. For decades, the group lived quietly on the fringes, moving around, keeping low profiles, posting philosophical essays online, and meticulously preparing for what they believed would be their cosmic departure. Then, in 1997, they saw the sign they'd been waiting for. The Hale-Bopp comet was passing near Earth. Rumors, fueled by tabloid radio and amateur astronomy message boards, began circulating that a spaceship was trailing behind it. Applewhite seized on the moment. He told his followers the time had come. The ship was real. Salvation was imminent. But first, they had to leave their human bodies behind. What followed was one of the most surreal moments in American cult history. Applewhite and 38 of his followers, dressed in identical black outfits and Nike sneakers, with purple shrouds neatly covering their faces, participated in a mass ritual they believed would allow them to transcend to the next plane of existence. They left behind farewell videos, journals, and a website that still exists today, a digital relic of a very analog tragedy. The shockwaves were immediate. The media was fascinated and horrified. The black humor was inevitable. The matching sneakers, the group's eerie calm, the fact that their final messages were filled not with fear, but serenity. But underneath the strangeness was something deeply human, a longing for purpose, for belonging, for escape. Applewhite didn't appear malevolent. He wasn't commanding legions or amassing wealth. He was fragile, unhinged, and genuinely convinced he'd found the exit ramp from Earth. But his belief, so powerful and unchecked, became a mirror for the American cult era, a time when people were desperate to believe anything that offered structure in a collapsing moral landscape. Heaven's Gate wasn't just about aliens, it was about faith, loneliness, and the consequences of wrapping your entire identity around someone else's apocalypse. And while Applewhite's spaceship never arrived, our next figure staged her own disappearance, not into space, but into the California coastline, claiming she had been kidnapped when she had simply gone missing on purpose. For reasons that were stranger than fiction, and somehow even less convincing. 33. Amy Semple McPherson. In 1926, Amy Semple McPherson was already a national phenomenon. A flamboyant evangelist, faith healer, and media sensation, she had built a religious empire in Los Angeles that blended old-time gospel with the razzle-dazzle of a Broadway revue. Her sermons were theatrical events, complete with costumes, props, and full orchestras. She preached about salvation, healing, and the power of the Holy Spirit. But with a distinctly Hollywood twist, she founded the International Church of the Foursquare Gospel, built the massive Angelus Temple, and was one of the first religious figures to embrace radio, turning her voice into a weekly fixture in homes across the country. She wasn't just preaching to the choir. She was turning faith into a broadcast empire. Then, one day in May 1926, she vanished. Gone. No note. No warning. Just walked into the Pacific Ocean, supposedly to cool off, and never returned. The public mourned. Thousands gathered at the beach, convinced she had drowned. Her followers were devastated. Newspapers ran headlines. A memorial service was held. But just as the nation was preparing to canonize her, McPherson reappeared, 5 weeks later, in the Arizona desert, with a wild story. She claimed she had been kidnapped, drugged, and held in a shack in Mexico before managing to escape and walk across the desert to freedom. It should have been a triumphant return, a tale of divine survival. Except, the details didn't add up, not even a little. Eyewitnesses reported seeing her in Northern California during the week she was missing. Hotel records, disguised aliases, and a suspiciously clean appearance upon her return all pointed to something else. A secret getaway, possibly with a man. Rumors swirled that she had been hiding out with a lover, and staged the kidnapping to protect her reputation. The Los Angeles District Attorney launched an investigation. Grand juries were convened. Reporters dug through her personal life like it was a crime scene. McPherson stuck to her story. Eventually, no charges were filed, but her reputation was never quite the same. She continued preaching, still had devoted followers, and maintained her media empire for years. But the disappearance, whether escape, scandal, or spiritual timeout, left a mark. It exposed the fragile line between persona and person, between spectacle and sincerity. McPherson was a trailblazer in American religion, a woman who turned theology into theater and worship into broadcast. But like many great performers, she couldn't quite step off the stage, even when the script unraveled. Her disappearing act may not have involved a spaceship or a death cult, but it captured the same spirit. The desperate need to control a narrative, even if you have to write it in the sand. Next up, a man who didn't disappear, because according to him, he was God, and he had no intention of being subtle about it. 34. Father Divine. When someone claims to be God, the standard response is usually an awkward silence or a swift exit, but not with Father Divine. In the early 20th century, people didn't just listen. They followed. They gave him money, reverence, and in many cases, their entire lives. Because Father Divine wasn't just claiming divinity, he was packaging it with dinner, real estate, and just enough moral ambiguity to keep you guessing. Born George Baker in the late 1800s, though he denied having a birth name at all, because God presumably doesn't need one, Father Divine rose to prominence in the 1920s and 1930s as the leader of the peace mission movement. His theology was a fusion of Christian metaphysics, self-help philosophy, and divine self-promotion. He insisted he was not merely a messenger of God, but God himself, walking the earth in a three-piece suit. And it worked. His followers swore by him. They believed in his healing powers, his prophecies, and his divine plan. He promised racial equality, economic justice, and moral purity. The peace mission was racially integrated at a time when such things could get you lynched. He preached abstinence, no alcohol, and no tobacco. But he wasn't just preaching. He was hosting banquets. Lots of them. In fact, some of the most iconic images of Father Divine's movement are of lavish feasts. Tables overflowing with food, packed with followers, many of them poor or working class, all fed for free. He owned hotels, restaurants, and apartment buildings. He refused to accept government assistance during the Great Depression, claiming his spiritual economy was stronger than the federal one. In many ways, his movement operated like a utopian business, efficient, charitable, and relentlessly branded. But then things got strange, stranger than the God-in-a-suit routine even. He married a Canadian woman named Edna Rose Richings, who was decades younger than him and white. The marriage scandalized both followers and outsiders. Father Divine insisted the relationship was spiritual only, and that Edna was the reincarnation of his first wife. This didn't make things less weird. It made them unsettling. He also got increasingly authoritarian. Followers turned over their money, lived in communal housing, and adhered to strict codes of conduct. Dissenters were ostracized, or worse. Critics accused him of exploiting his base and creating a personality cult wrapped in religious jargon. And yet, he was never charged with a crime, never arrested for fraud, never sued successfully. He died in 1965, still surrounded by loyalists, still calling himself God, still wearing that calm, inscrutable smile. Father Divine was many things: preacher, businessman, icon, enigma. He used religion not as a moral compass, but as a brand, a way to organize power, loyalty, and wealth. He didn't ask for belief. He declared it, and dared the world to contradict him. But if Father Divine called himself God on earth, our next subject became a god of the air. Before locking himself in a hotel room, collecting his fingernails in jars, and forgetting how to leave. 35. Howard Hughes. Howard Hughes is what happens when genius meets unlimited money and runs out of breaks. He was the golden boy of early 20th century America, a dashing aviator, a film director, a playboy, and a corporate titan. Hughes didn't just succeed, he dominated. He broke aviation records, made blockbuster films, and bought entire companies like they were toys. His life was equal parts dazzle and spectacle, and for a time, he seemed unstoppable. He directed Hell's Angels in 1930, one of the most expensive films of its era. He dated Katharine Hepburn and Ava Gardner. He designed revolutionary aircraft, including the famous H-4 Hercules, better known as the Spruce Goose, a massive wooden flying boat that flew exactly once for less than a minute before becoming a museum exhibit and metaphor. Hughes also ran Trans World Airlines, outmaneuvering Pan Am and battling Congress in the process. He was not just rich, he was powerful. But then came the turn. And it wasn't sudden. It was slow, strange, and deeply American in its unraveling. By the 1950s, Hughes became increasingly reclusive. He developed an obsessive-compulsive disorder that worsened with age. He feared germs, wore tissue boxes on his feet, and insisted on bizarre, highly specific rituals for eating, sleeping, and handling objects. He holed up in a series of hotel rooms, first in Los Angeles, then Las Vegas, then the Bahamas, blacking out windows, avoiding human contact, and communicating through notes. He ran his business empire from bed, often naked, surrounded by stacks of tissues, containers of his own bodily waste, and loops of old movies playing endlessly. His once brilliant mind turned inward, cannibalized by phobias and paranoia. And yet, his companies still functioned. His money still flowed. People still referred to him as a genius, even when he hadn't been seen in public in years. Rumors about Hughes became the stuff of urban legend. He had body doubles. He was dead. He was a puppet controlled by his aides. No one really knew. and that ambiguity only fed the mystique. In the end, he died in 1976 aboard a plane en route to a hospital, emaciated, disoriented, and unrecognizable. Howard Hughes is a uniquely American tragedy. A man who had it all, did it all, and then erased himself. He was wealth without joy, genius without peace, ambition without tether. He didn't burn out or fade away. He just withdrew, like a billionaire ghost. And speaking of ghost-like figures who defy categorization, our next subject took a detour from the basketball court into one of the most diplomatically bizarre bromances in world history. With a dictator, no less. 36. Dennis Rodman. Dennis Rodman was already strange before North Korea. As an NBA player, he was chaos in motion, rebounding machine, defensive mastermind, fashion anarchist. With rainbow-dyed hair, body piercings, and a taste for cross-dressing, Rodman stormed through the 1990s like a human middle finger to conformity. He won 5 NBA championships, dated Madonna, married himself, in a wedding dress, naturally, and became the walking embodiment of, "You can't tell me what to do." But no one could have predicted where he'd go next, Pyongyang. Rodman's relationship with North Korean dictator Kim Jong-un began in 2013, when he visited the country with members of the Harlem Globetrotters for a Vice Media basketball exhibition. What was supposed to be a novelty trip turned into a full-blown friendship. Kim, an obsessed basketball fan, treated Rodman like a royal guest. They watched games together, rode horses, smoked cigars, and reportedly sang karaoke. Rodman called him a friend for life. The world blinked in confusion. Here was a man known for drunken Las Vegas escapades and unpredictable rants, suddenly acting as an unofficial envoy to one of the world's most secretive and repressive regimes. Rodman insisted it wasn't political. He was just there for basketball. But then he started defending Kim, brushing off human rights abuses, claiming the dictator was misunderstood, and lashing out at critics with slurred, tearful rants during interviews. To be fair, Rodman wasn't trying to be a diplomat. He just stumbled into the role. One part celebrity, one part novelty act, one part cautionary tale. He treated geopolitics like a house party he hadn't really read the invite for. And yet, somehow, he got results. Sort of. Rodman was one of the few Americans with direct access to Kim during a particularly tense period in U.S.-North Korea relations. He brought back messages. He delivered strange gifts. He even sang Happy Birthday to Kim, off-key, in front of a basketball crowd in Pyongyang. Was it useful? Probably not. Was it real diplomacy? Definitely not. But it was unforgettable. Rodman remains a cultural anomaly. Too strange to dismiss, too earnest to fully mock, too unpredictable to ignore. His friendship with Kim Jong-un may never make sense, but then, neither did Dennis Rodman's career. He turned spectacle into substance, and somehow convinced a brutal dictator to watch dunk contests while the world tried to make sense of it all. And next, we pivot from surreal diplomacy to surreal violence, featuring a boxing legend, a severed ear, and the moment sports became something else entirely. 37. Mike Tyson. Mike Tyson wasn't just a boxer. He was a demolition job in human form. At his peak, Tyson didn't fight opponents. He erased them. With fists that seemed to travel faster than most people's thoughts, and a scowl that could curdle milk, he became the youngest heavyweight champion in history at 20 years old. He unified titles, terrified press rooms, and entered the ring like a man already halfway through a bar fight. But behind the bruising victories and pre-fight threats was a chaos that never quite stayed in the locker room. Tyson's career was a Shakespearean spectacle in boxing gloves, meteoric rise, spectacular fall, and more comebacks than a soap opera character. And the defining moment, the one that crossed from sports page to global infamy, came on June 28, 1997. The night Tyson bit Evander Holyfield's ear during a rematch. The bout was already tense. Their previous fight had ended with Holyfield winning, and Tyson feeling, in his mind, cheated. So in the rematch, when Holyfield's head collided with Tyson's, unintentionally or not, something in Tyson snapped. During a clinch, Tyson leaned in and took a bite out of Holyfield's ear. Not metaphorically, literally. The fight was stopped, restarted, then stopped for good after a second bite attempt. The crowd lost it. The broadcaster scrambled for words. Tyson was disqualified, fined $3 million, and had his boxing license temporarily revoked. Headlines called him an animal. Late-night shows had a field day. The world was equal parts horrified and fascinated. How does a heavyweight champion resort to something out of a zombie movie? The answer, as always with Tyson, was complicated. He was a man forged in trauma, raised in poverty, manipulated by handlers, and tossed into the spotlight long before he understood the rules of life, let alone the rules of boxing. His early mentor, Cus D'Amato, gave him discipline and belief. But after D'Amato's death, Tyson drifted toward enablers, opportunists, and a lifestyle that outpaced his ability to keep up. He lost titles. He lost money. He lost control. But he never lost interest. Tyson remained a cultural presence, acting in films, doing one-man shows, raising pigeons, and occasionally lapsing into philosophical musings that revealed a strange, jagged kind of self-awareness. In later years, he seemed to understand the absurdity of his own mythology, describing himself as both a monster and a man trying to evolve beyond it. Today, the earbite is a meme, a punchline, a historical artifact of one of the wildest nights in sports. But it's also the moment the mask slipped, not just for Tyson, but for all of boxing. A reminder that beneath the pageantry and promotion, it's still a brutal sport full of real men with real tempers, and occasionally, real teeth. But if Tyson lost his mind in the ring, our next figure lost his on stage, online, and eventually on the campaign trail. One outrageous statement at a time until even his own fans weren't sure if he was serious. 38. Kanye West. Kanye West has never done anything halfway, except maybe apologize. He's the cultural chameleon who redefined hip-hop, reimagined fashion, and then tried to rebrand himself as a political force. And in every phase, he left chaos, brilliance, and headlines in his wake. At first, he was untouchable, the backpack rapper turned super producer who brought soul samples and self-reflection into a genre dominated by braggadocio and bravado. Albums like The College Dropout and My Beautiful Dark Twisted Fantasy weren't just hits, they were declarations. Kanye wasn't here to blend in, he was here to rewrite the rules. And then, slowly, the rules stopped mattering altogether. West's career has always walked the tightrope between genius and meltdown. But what pushed him into the realm of historical infamy wasn't his fashion line or his Twitter account. It was the cumulative effect of saying the quiet part out loud, and then yelling it through a megaphone. There was the moment in 2005, live on national TV during a Hurricane Katrina fundraiser, when he turned to the camera and declared, "George Bush doesn't care about black people." That was unexpected. It was awkward. It was also, to many, not wrong. But it marked the beginning of Kanye treating the spotlight as a confessional booth. From there, the statements only got more erratic. He claimed slavery was a choice. He ran for president in 2020. Yes, seriously, under the birthday party, wearing a bulletproof vest and breaking down in tears at campaign events. He claimed vaccines were the mark of the beast. He said the devil was controlling social media. And perhaps most infamously, he publicly expressed admiration for Adolf Hitler, not just once but repeatedly, and with the kind of conviction that made people wonder if it was a stunt or a total psychological unmooring. By the time most of the corporate world cut ties with him, Kanye had managed to alienate nearly everyone, fans, colleagues, communities, even his own business empire. And yet, he never stopped talking, or posting, or pushing the boundaries between art, performance, and a kind of self-destructive spiral. To his supporters, Kanye is still a visionary, a misunderstood artist in a society that punishes radical truth-telling. To others, he's a cautionary tale of what happens when fame isolates you from reality, and your inner circle becomes a yes-man echo chamber. But either way, Kanye West became a symbol of the modern celebrity meltdown, one amplified by technology, protected by wealth, and fueled by the delusion that if you say something with enough conviction, it must be true. Still, even Kanye didn't physically sabotage his own career. At least not in the way our next figure did. Because when your job is to compete on ice and your rival mysteriously gets clubbed in the kneecap before a big event, well, let's just say you might be on thin ice. Literally. 39. Tonya Harding. Tonya Harding was supposed to be a champion. A working-class figure skater with raw talent, ferocious determination, and the kind of athleticism judges couldn't ignore. She was the first American woman to land a triple axel in competition. A move so difficult it was practically a magic trick. For a brief moment in the early 1990s, Harding was a rising star in a sport dominated by country club elegance and pageant smiles. She was none of those things, and that made her unforgettable. But the story of Tonya Harding isn't about athletic triumph. It's about what came next. The scandal that shattered American figure skating and turned a high-stakes Olympic drama into tabloid mythology. In January 1994, Harding's rival, Nancy Kerrigan, was attacked after a practice session. A man hit her in the leg with a baton, injuring her and jeopardizing her Olympic dreams. The footage of Kerrigan wailing, why, became instantly iconic, looping endlessly on every news outlet in America. Within days, the truth began to unravel. The attacker was linked to Harding's ex-husband, Jeff Gillooly, and her bodyguard. The plan had been, allegedly, to knock Kerrigan out of the competition, clearing Harding's path to Olympic gold. What followed was a legal and media circus. Harding denied involvement. She wept on camera. She skated under a cloud of suspicion all the way to Lillehammer, where she placed 8th. Kerrigan, miraculously recovered, won the silver. Eventually, Harding pleaded guilty to obstructing the investigation. She avoided jail, but was banned for life from competitive figure skating. Just like that, one of the most promising careers in the sport was over. Harding became a national punchline. The trailer park figure skater who hired a hitman. The punchline to every late-night joke. But the truth, as always, was messier. She grew up poor, abused, constantly fighting for legitimacy in a sport that preferred its stars to be elegant, silent, and well-behaved. Harding wasn't that. She was tough, scrappy, loud, and the scandal confirmed what many in the skating world had always feared, that she didn't belong. In later years, Harding tried everything: celebrity boxing, reality TV, tell-all interviews. Her story was eventually re-examined in the 2017 film I, Tonya, which painted a more sympathetic, if still chaotic, portrait. But the legacy stuck. Tonya Harding remains a uniquely American figure. Not just because she fell, but because we watched her fall. In slow motion, on repeat, and from the rink to the Senate floor, our next figure didn't just fall. He spent his entire career actively blocking progress and proudly filibustering the moral arc of history. 40. Theodore Bilbo. Theodore G. Bilbo was the kind of man who made even other racists uncomfortable. A 2-time governor of Mississippi and later a U.S. senator, Bilbo didn't just oppose civil rights. He did it with such gleeful venom that he made the worst parts of American history seem like a script he couldn't wait to recite. While many Southern politicians in the early 20th century masked their bigotry behind coded language and polite euphemisms, Bilbo smashed through decorum like a man late to a lynching-themed costume party. He didn't bother with dog whistles. He preferred megaphones. He believed black Americans should be deported to Africa. He believed segregation was God's plan. He believed his own voice was one of divine purpose, which is possibly why he never stopped using it, even when everyone else wished he would. Bilbo first rose to prominence in Mississippi as governor in the 1910s and 1920s, where he governed with all the subtlety of a brick through a stained glass window. His policies were populist in tone, but deeply authoritarian in practice. He railed against corruption, while practicing his own brand of political bossism, stacking government jobs with loyalists and playing hardball with opponents. By the time he reached the U.S. Senate in the 1930s, Bilbo had perfected the art of the hateful filibuster. One of his proudest moments, and America's lowest, came when he led the opposition to anti-lynching legislation in 1938. The bill would have made it a federal crime to stand by and allow a lynch mob to murder someone. Bilbo didn't just oppose it. He gave a marathon speech against it, full of racial slurs and violent threats, declaring that any federal attempt to protect black lives in the South was a damnable outrage. The bill failed. Bilbo kept going. He spent his final years in the Senate issuing pamphlets urging white Americans to resist mongrelization and preserve the purity of the white race. In 1946, he won re-election. Again. But the Senate, finally fed up with his antics, refused to seat him. He died shortly afterward, still clinging to the belief that he had done the Lord's work by keeping America pure. Today, Bilbo's name is mostly forgotten outside of history classrooms and footnotes in civil rights documentaries. There are no major statues, no airports, no boulevards. Just the echo of a man who thought he could shout hate into permanence, only to find that time eventually shouts back. But if Bilbo filibustered progress, the next man stood in a school doorway to physically stop it, becoming the poster child for resistance to racial integration, and an unwilling symbol of his own defeat. 41. George Wallace. George Wallace's legacy is forever linked to one moment, June 11, 1963. The cameras were rolling, the press was packed, and there he was, the governor of Alabama, standing in the entrance of Foster Auditorium at the University of Alabama, physically blocking two black students, Vivian Malone and James Hood, from registering for classes. He called it the stand in the schoolhouse door, and it was his most theatrical stand against desegregation. Federal marshals, acting under the orders of President John F. Kennedy, confronted him. Faced with overwhelming federal authority, Wallace stepped aside. But the image had already been burned into the national consciousness. A white man trying to hold back history with a scowl and a microphone. Wallace had built his political career on segregation. His infamous 1963 inaugural address included the phrase that would define him and haunt him: segregation now, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever. He rode that rhetoric straight to national prominence, becoming a four-term governor and a serious presidential contender in 1968, 1972, and 1976. But Wallace wasn't just a Southern problem. His message, cloaked in states' rights and law and order, found eager audiences across the country. He tapped into white resentment, blue-collar frustration, and a deep vein of post-civil rights backlash that remains disturbingly relevant today. He didn't invent dog-whistle politics. He just cranked up the volume. Then came 1972. During a campaign event in Maryland, Wallace was shot and paralyzed from the waist down by a would-be assassin. The attack ended his presidential ambitions, but also, ironically, started a slow transformation. In the years that followed, Wallace began apologizing for his segregationist past. He publicly sought forgiveness from black leaders. He met with civil rights activists. He even won re-election as governor in 1982 with significant black support. But whether his repentance was sincere or strategic remains debated. Some say he changed. Others say he changed tactics. Either way, the stain of his earlier rhetoric remained indelible. Wallace died in 1998. In later interviews, he expressed regret. He spoke of pain, of sin, of mistakes made in the name of power. But the man who once pledged to block the door to education ended his life quietly, in a wheelchair, no longer trying to stop the world from moving forward. And yet his echo lingers. Every time someone invokes states' rights to justify injustice, or rebrands hate as heritage, they're walking through the same rhetorical door Wallace once stood in front of. Our next figure didn't bother with rhetorical doors. He preferred literal ones. and made national headlines for refusing to serve black customers in a fried chicken joint. 42. Lester Maddox. Lester Maddox was the kind of man who made a political career out of serving drumsticks with a side of defiance. In the early 1960s, Maddox owned the Pickrick Cafeteria in Atlanta, a humble fried chicken joint with decent food, low prices, and an absolutely immovable policy: no black customers allowed. When the Civil Rights Act of 1964 made segregation in public accommodations illegal, Maddox refused to comply. And not quietly. He famously greeted would-be black patrons with a loaded gun and a handful of axe handles. Yes, literal axe handles, which he handed out to white customers to help defend the restaurant. This wasn't theater. This was deliberate provocation. Maddox became an overnight sensation in the segregationist South, not despite his actions, but because of them. He eventually closed the Pickrick rather than integrate, turning himself into a martyr for the lost cause crowd. Then, in a moment of political absurdity that could only happen in America, he leveraged that fame into a run for governor of Georgia, and won. Governor Maddox was a contradiction in motion. On the one hand, he appointed more black officials than any Georgia governor before him. On the other, he refused to allow integrated seating at state functions. He rode a bicycle backward through the governor's mansion to prove some convoluted point about freedom. He sang folk songs at press events. He was both caricature and contender, a political clown who occasionally stumbled into policy. After his term, Maddox kept trying to return to power. He ran for lieutenant governor. He ran for president. He opened a bizarre hybrid restaurant museum called the Pickrick Drumstick, where visitors could eat fried chicken and browse memorabilia from his segregationist glory days. He never quite regained his influence, but he never lost his platform. Even decades later, he was still defending his actions, insisting he had never been a racist, just a lover of liberty. That claim, of course, rested on the premise that liberty included the right to deny others basic human rights. Lester Maddox died in 2003, still unapologetic, still confusing stubbornness for principle. His legacy, like his campaign slogans, was all caps and no nuance. But if Maddox stood at the counter of a chicken restaurant and refused progress, our next subject had an entire country's military at his command, and used it to enact one of the most brutal and forced displacements in American history. 43. Andrew Jackson. Andrew Jackson is one of those presidents whose portraits hang in schools and courtrooms, while the details of his legacy quietly scream from the footnotes. To his admirers, he was a populist war hero, a self-made man who fought the elites and championed the common, white American. To everyone else, including many historians with functioning moral compasses, he was a deeply flawed figure who used the presidency not just to govern, but to bulldoze entire populations out of existence. Jackson's most infamous act? The Indian Removal Act of 1830. A policy so brazenly cruel that it feels less like lawmaking and more like a slow-motion purge disguised as paperwork. Signed and enforced under his administration, the act gave the federal government authority to relocate Native American tribes from their ancestral lands in the southeastern United States to territories west of the Mississippi River. Jackson pitched it as a win-win. Settlers got land, tribes got protection. What followed was anything but. The removals culminated in what's now known as the Trail of Tears, a series of forced marches by the Cherokee, Creek, Seminole, Chickasaw, and Choctaw nations, among others. Thousands died from exposure, disease, and starvation along the way. Jackson, meanwhile, remained proud of the policy, insisting it was for the tribe's own good. His critics at the time, and there were many, called it a disgrace. Modern assessments tend to agree. Jackson's defenders like to point out his military leadership during the Battle of New Orleans or his war against the National Bank. They praise his rough frontier persona, the orphan who became president. But that scrappy origin story always came wrapped in violence. He owned enslaved people, fought duels, and built his fortune on stolen land and human suffering. In many ways, Jackson was the first political brand, larger than life, unyielding, mythologized in real time. But the myth obscures the man, And the man wasn't simply of his time. He was worse than it. Still, he's on the $20 bill, at least for now. Because if Jackson institutionalized removal, our next figure brought the concept into the television age, complete with state troopers, camera crews, and a steely resolve to stop 9 teenagers from going to school. 44. Orval Faubus. Orval Faubus wasn't the first Southern governor to oppose integration, but he was the one who did it on live television. In 1957, as part of a federal court order to desegregate Little Rock Central High School, 9 black students, later known as the Little Rock Nine, prepared to attend classes. The Supreme Court had already ruled in Brown v. Board of Education that school segregation was unconstitutional. The moral arc of the universe, it seemed, was bending toward justice. Faubus grabbed a crowbar. On the eve of integration, the Arkansas governor ordered the state's National Guard to block the students from entering the school, claiming it was for their safety. It was a transparent move to appease segregationists and ignite his political base. What he ignited instead was a constitutional crisis and a showdown with President Eisenhower. For nearly 3 weeks, the students were prevented from attending school. Mobs formed. Reporters were attacked. The world watched as American democracy tried and failed to enforce its own laws. Eisenhower eventually had enough. He federalized the Arkansas National Guard, removed them from Faubus's control, and sent in the 101st Airborne Division, actual paratroopers, to escort the students. It was a humiliating loss for Faubus, but he turned it into political capital, spinning his defeat into martyrdom. In Arkansas, it worked. He won re-election, more than once. Faubus didn't just resist change, he weaponized it. He understood that in the South, during the Civil Rights era, obstruction wasn't a liability. It was a resume booster. He played the long game of coded defiance, wrapping his actions in vague language about states' rights and law and order, all while being very clear about his real intentions. Later in life, he tried to soften his image. He gave interviews where he talked about the complexity of the times, his supposed concern for student safety, and his eventual regret. But those words came decades too late, after his place in history was already cemented. Faubus wasn't a man caught in the current of history. He was the guy paddling backward, loudly, publicly, and with a smug grin. He made the state of Arkansas a battleground in the war over school integration, and for that, he was either loved or loathed, but never forgotten. Our next subject, however, was almost entirely forgotten, until he was wrongly accused of a terrorist attack, and his name became shorthand for how quickly media hysteria can destroy a man's life. 45. Richard Jewell. Richard Jewell was a security guard. That's it. Not a secret agent, not a criminal mastermind, not a hero with a dark past, just a guy doing his job. A little too well, it turned out. In the summer of 1996, during the Atlanta Olympics, Jewell discovered a suspicious backpack under a bench in Centennial Park. He alerted authorities, helped evacuate the area. The bomb exploded. 1 person died, dozens were injured, but the casualty count could have been far worse. For a moment, Jewell was hailed as a hero. Then, the narrative flipped. Within days, an anonymous FBI source leaked that Jewell fit the profile of a lone bomber, a frustrated white male with a hero complex. The media pounced. News vans parked outside his apartment. Headlines ran wild with speculation. Late-night hosts mocked him. His entire life was dissected in real time, turned into a spectacle of suspicion. And all of it was wrong. Jewell was never charged. In fact, he had done everything right. But the accusations stuck like wet cement. The FBI searched his home, took his possessions, interviewed his friends, his mother, his neighbors. For 88 days, he lived under a cloud of national suspicion, all because he matched someone's psychological profile, and the press needed a narrative with a face. Eventually, authorities admitted he wasn't the bomber. Years later, the real culprit, Eric Robert Rudolph, was captured and confessed. But by then, the damage to Jewell's life was irreversible. He filed defamation lawsuits, some of which he won. He gave interviews, some bitter, some philosophical. He tried to move on, but he never fully escaped the shadow of his own false accusation. Jewell died in 2007 at the age of 44 from heart failure. By then, the story had been retold so many times that he had become more symbol than man. A case study in media malpractice, FBI missteps, and the high cost of public hysteria. He didn't commit a crime. He didn't start a cult. He didn't run for office. But he still belongs on this list, because his story reveals something about American society that's even more unsettling, that once the machine of suspicion starts turning, the truth becomes optional. And from a man unjustly accused to one who quite literally vanished from prison with the help of a rubber raft and a good storm, our next entry is a different kind of mystery altogether. 46. Edward Cornelius. If you've ever watched a prison escape movie and thought, okay, but that would never actually work, meet Edward Cornelius, the real-life proof that sometimes it kind of does. Cornelius was one of the lesser-known figures to vanish from Alcatraz, America's most infamous maximum security prison. Built on a rock in the middle of San Francisco Bay and surrounded by frigid, sharky waters and vicious tides, Alcatraz was supposed to be escape-proof. That's what made it iconic. Not just a prison, but the prison. A place where they sent the incorrigibles, the escape artists, the men for whom other prisons were mere warm-up acts. And Cornelius? He didn't like being told no. Little is publicly documented about Cornelius's background, and that's part of the mystery. He was, by all available records, not one of the more notorious criminals of the 20th century. He was more of a professional escapee than a hardened gangster, someone whose greatest talent was slipping through cracks. By the time he ended up on the Rock, Cornelius had already earned a reputation as a flight risk. So when reports surfaced in the early 1940s that he had escaped, eyebrows went up. His method? Ingenious in its simplicity. He and possibly others constructed a makeshift raft using stolen raincoats, inflated and sealed with heat and spit, and whatever else they could find that passed for waterproofing. They waited for the right weather, the right shift change, and, just like that, Cornelius was gone. Gone as in, not in his cell. Gone as in, not floating outside the walls like a failed magician. Gone as in, no footprints, no note. Most assume he drowned. The San Francisco Bay is unforgiving, and plenty of would-be escapees had met their end in its icy grip. But no body was ever recovered, no raft ever found, and no confirmed sighting of Cornelius ever surfaced. Which, of course, is exactly what made him a legend. His name is rarely spoken in the same breath as the more famous 1962 escapees, Frank Morris and the Anglin brothers, whose escape inspired books and a Clint Eastwood film. But Cornelius was arguably the blueprint. He proved it could be done. That the supposedly perfect prison had flaws. That human ingenuity and desperation don't care much for walls. To this day, his story is a loose thread in the carefully tailored suit of American justice, a reminder that sometimes the people you least expect are the ones who slip through the cracks. And speaking of men who tempted fate once too often, the next figure didn't escape prison. He escaped life entirely by daring one waterfall too many, chasing applause all the way to his watery grave. 47. Sam Patch. Sam Patch was America's first professional daredevil, a man who discovered in the early 1800s that if you jump off tall things in front of large crowds, they will cheer and then pay you to do it again. Born into poverty in Rhode Island, Patch worked in cotton mills as a child and began jumping off factory dams during his breaks, partly out of boredom and partly because no one told him not to. He found he had a knack for it, not just the falling, but the landing. He knew how to stay vertical, how to hit water like it was a performance, how to survive just enough to build a reputation. And he did. By the 1820s, Sam Patch had transformed himself into a national curiosity. He jumped from bridges, cliffs, and waterfalls, including the famed Passaic Falls in New Jersey and Niagara Falls. Well, not over Niagara Falls, but from a platform next to them, still terrifying. His catchphrase was, "Some things can be done as well as others," which, while confusing, became oddly iconic. It was basically 19th century branding. Patch wore simple clothes, often dressed like a working man, because he was one. His persona wasn't aristocratic daredevil, it was scrappy, everyman risk-taker. He became a symbol of American boldness, a living metaphor for the era's obsession with testing boundaries. But his greatest stunt would also be his last. In November 1829, Patch traveled to Rochester, New York, to jump from the high falls of the Genesee River. He did a first jump, survived, and the crowd roared. Then, feeling the thrill and maybe the pressure of outdoing himself, he announced a second jump. Bigger platform, greater height, more danger. He jumped, and he disappeared. They found his body days later, miles downstream, frozen and battered. The crowd was stunned. Sam Patch, the man who had cheated death for applause, had finally miscalculated, or simply pushed his luck past its expiration date. He became a folk legend almost immediately. Poems were written, songs sung. Towns named things after him. He was buried under a stone that read simply, Sam Patch. Such is fame. Patch's story isn't just about risk. It's about how early America turned recklessness into entertainment. Before there were stuntmen, before viral videos, there was a guy in threadbare pants jumping off cliffs because it felt like a kind of freedom. His legacy is a quiet warning. Just because something can be done doesn't mean it should be, especially not twice in a row. And from a man who plunged off waterfalls to die for applause, we go to another eccentric who plunged into literature, writing books without punctuation, selling imaginary goods, and declaring himself a lord in a town that humored him just enough to keep him going. 48. Timothy Dexter. Timothy Dexter was America's first accidental millionaire, and possibly its first genuine eccentric capitalist. He didn't just stumble into wealth, he cannonballed into it, face first, with the confidence of a man who'd never read a financial report but assumed he could outsmart the market through sheer audacity. Born in 1747 in Massachusetts, Dexter came from humble beginnings and barely any formal education. He made his first fortune during the Revolutionary War by buying depreciated continental currency, paper money so worthless that people were using it as wallpaper. But Dexter, oblivious or visionary depending on your perspective, bought huge amounts of it at pennies on the dollar. Then, miraculously, the government decided to honor the notes at partial value. Dexter was suddenly absurdly rich, but wealth didn't buy him respect. The Boston elite mocked him. So Dexter moved to Newburyport, bought a mansion, filled the lawn with statues of famous people, including himself, naturally, and declared himself Lord Timothy Dexter. It wasn't a joke. At least not to him. His business ventures became legendary for their stupidity and their inexplicable success. He once shipped warming pans, used to heat beds, to the Caribbean, assuming people in tropical climates needed them. Locals reportedly used them as ladles for molasses. They sold out. He sent coal to Newcastle, a British city famous for its coal production, only to discover the mines were on strike. Again, he sold out. He sold Bibles to East India, hoops for women's skirts to the South Pacific, gloves to the West Indies. Every time, someone found a use, or humored him, or the market shifted just enough to turn idiocy into profit. His crowning achievement, or perhaps warning sign, was his book, A Pickle for the Knowing Ones. It was a rambling, barely coherent manifesto that contained no punctuation and spelled words however he liked. Critics pointed this out, so in the second edition, Dexter included an entire page of punctuation marks at the end, telling readers to pepper and salt it as they please. He was, in many ways, America's first troll entrepreneur, so earnestly strange that he almost felt like satire. Yet he remained wildly rich, deeply proud, and mostly harmless. Dexter died in 1806, leaving behind a fortune, a deeply confused literary legacy, and generations of readers who still ask, was he a fool or a genius pretending to be one? Which brings us to the final name on this list. A man who didn't just pretend to be royalty. He declared it. And for reasons still unknown, an entire city went along with it. 49. Joshua Norton, Emperor Norton I. In 1859, a man named Joshua Abraham Norton walked into a San Francisco newspaper office and declared himself Emperor of the United States. He handed over a short proclamation. No army, no voters, no campaign, just vibes. And to everyone's surprise, the paper printed it. Thus began the reign of Emperor Norton I, a man with no legal power, no real wealth, and no intention of letting those details get in the way of his imperial destiny. Norton was born in England, raised in South Africa, and eventually found his way to San Francisco in the mid-1800s, where he tried his hand at real estate and commodities trading. For a while, he did quite well. But as with so many before and after, one bad deal, in his case a speculative bet on Peruvian rice, cost him everything. He filed for bankruptcy, disappeared from the public eye, and re-emerged as something entirely new, an emperor. From that moment on, Norton strolled the streets of San Francisco in a blue military-style uniform, adorned with epaulettes, a top hat with a peacock feather, and a ceremonial sword. He issued royal decrees on everything from the abolition of Congress to the construction of a bridge between Oakland and San Francisco, a suggestion that seemed ludicrous at the time and is now known as the Bay Bridge. He was, objectively, delusional. And yet, San Francisco embraced him. Local businesses accepted his self-issued currency. Police officers saluted him. Restaurants fed him for free. When one officer tried to arrest him for vagrancy, the public outcry was so intense that the police chief issued a formal apology and released him, stating that he had no right to arrest His Majesty. Norton became a fixture in parades, a regular on the cable cars, and a daily reader of the local papers, where his proclamations were routinely published like dispatches from a parallel universe. He never begged, never threatened, and never harmed a soul. In an era of gold rush greed, political corruption, and rampant social inequality, Norton stood out precisely because he didn't want power. He wanted meaning. He played the part of a monarch with such quiet sincerity that mocking him felt like punching a cloud. His popularity extended beyond novelty. Mark Twain, who lived in San Francisco during Norton's reign, is believed to have drawn inspiration from him when creating the character of the king in The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. Norton's death in 1880 brought the city to a standstill. Over 10,000 people attended his funeral. Newspapers ran headlines reading, "The King is dead." Flags flew at half-mast. Businesses closed in mourning. There was no lineage, no throne, no crown. Just a man who declared himself important, and was, because others believed it too. In the end, Joshua Norton may not have been the ruler America needed, but he was the one San Francisco chose. And in choosing him, the city quietly declared that maybe, just maybe, madness with kindness is better than sanity with cruelty. And with that, we end our journey through the 49 biggest idiots in American history, not with rage or scandal, but with a man who wore a hat too big for his head and carried the burden of delusion like it was a royal scepter. But then again, maybe the real lesson of this list is that idiocy isn't just about being wrong. It's about being wrong loudly, proudly, and with an audience willing to clap anyway.